Hi, my name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Governed. Thank you for watching. Today we're going to be discussing Washington State's jungle primary system. It's a top 2 primary system. We're going to talk about why we have it in this state and how it could affect the 2020 governor's race. So today we're going to be talking about Washington State elections and how does a top 2 primary work. And I know that doesn't sound super exciting, but the reason why I wanted to cover this topic today is I've had so many emails and comments from activists and from voters around the state that I can tell there's some confusion as to how the primary system works. Sometimes it's people who've moved here from out of state, and sometimes it's people who just haven't probably paid that much attention to it. And there's always a little bit of confusion about how a top 2 primary works. And so I want to explain that and also explain a little bit about the history as to how we got here in Washington State, because we are an unusual state in how our primary system works, and it's worth discussing so that people know. So first you have to talk about what a primary is. And a primary is basically just a way for political parties to choose their candidates and determine which candidate is going to be on the ballot in November. And so there's all kinds of ways of doing that. And traditionally, when Washington State was formed in 1889, we had our first elections in 1890, and from 1890 to 1907, Washington State really didn't have any rules when it came to primaries as to how political parties chose their candidates. They could pick their candidates any way they wanted to, in backroom meetings, smoke-filled rooms, and it really didn't matter. Those candidates just simply came and the identities were given to the local auditor in each county, and that's who went on the ballot, and that's who ran for office. And Washington State was obviously more rural than it is today, and there were, people would hitch up their wagons and get on their horses, and they would go down to the polling station and vote. And the photo right here is actually a photo from 1890, and this is the inauguration of Washington State's first governor. And you can see from this inauguration, it's the horse and buggies pulling up. It's a celebration in Olympia, and this is probably how political parties generally got together and had their votes as well at that time. However, Washington State was changing, and there was kind of a progressive movement and some frustration among average citizens in Washington State against government in general and against this perception that political parties had too much power. And so they wanted to right the wrongs that they saw going on around them. And in 1907, Washington State legislature passed basically a requirement in the primary process that said if you were a major party with more than 10%, your candidate could get more than 10% of the vote in the past, that your candidate's, the primary, your candidate had to be on the ballot, which meant they had to have an open election held at the auditor's office, just like the November ballot. And so this was a pretty radical change at the time, a pretty big deal. And now parties couldn't make these decisions, in their smoke-filled rooms. They had to come out and say, well, here's a couple of our candidates. There's a primary. Let's pick who's going to be the person that we choose to go on the ballot in the November election. Now, again, being a progressive area in Washington State, the other things that were also going on was this effort to kind of the suffrage movement that was going on, which was to give women the right to vote. And across the country, women got the right to vote in 1920 with an amendment to the to the federal Constitution. Washington State, though, was way ahead of the curve and actually gave women the right to vote in 1909, and in 1910, women had the opportunity to start voting for the first time in Washington State history, and there's a lot of history behind this. And so this kind of a movement was going on at the same time that these changes in the primary voting system was occurring in Washington State. Now, in 1921, the state legislature, probably at the behest of political parties, both Republican and Democrat, probably put pressure on them, but they decided to start changing the voter registration process in Washington State, and they basically passed a couple laws, one of which changed how precinct committee officers were elected, the other one, which basically said you had to register for whatever your political party affiliation would have been. And this was not received very well by the voters at the time. And the people who lived in Washington State, very independent people, again, they don't like political parties generally, so they ran 2 different referendums, so referendum 14 and 15, basically to repeal those 2 pieces of legislation. And they got them on the ballot and they passed 73%. It was overwhelming, no doubt. The voters absolutely of Washington State did not want to be pigeonholed into a political party. They wanted the ability to vote one year for a Democrat. They wanted the ability the next year to vote for a Republican. They wanted to make up their mind when they went to the booth. They didn't want to register and be considered affiliated with a party for their entire time or their entire residency. And here's a picture actually from the 1920s. Voting was important, people were involved, and civic engagement at its height as referendums in the 1920s. And just to make sure, because the voters of Washington State at the time were suspicious of political parties, and they were suspicious of the legislature, and they didn't trust them. So in 1934, they ran a citizens initiative that basically required that voters would not be, that basically said the state could not force voters to identify with a party until they went to vote and they could pick their candidates. So they didn't have to be identified, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. They could be whatever they wanted, and they would vote only on election day for their respective political candidates that they wanted to choose. So that's how things went. Now, of course, the parties didn't like that. In 1936, there was a lawsuit, but the Supreme Court upheld it. And so basically, since 1934, although it was occasionally challenged by other political parties, in 1978, I think was the most recent times, and there was occasionally rumblings in the legislature to make some changes, until 2004, the primary system in Washington State stayed pretty much the same. And so you didn't have to register as affiliated with any kind of party, and come election day, you could decide if you were going to, in primary, you could decide, am I going to vote for a Republican or am I going to vote in the Democrat primary? So what happened in 2004? Well, first we have to set the stage. The political parties didn't like blanket primaries because it took away a lot of their power. And in 2000, in a case called California Democratic Party versus Jones, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that California's blanket primary was illegal, and their blanket primary is very similar to Washington State's. So in 2001, the Washington State Secretary of State held these hearings around the state, about 11 of them, and they took surveys of voters, and they really wanted to get a sense of what the voters in Washington State wanted. And the result was that there was an overwhelmingly positive support for this blanket primary system and strong opposition from voters in being identified with a political party. A strong streak of independence runs in Washington State, and these surveys really supported that. However, in 2002, in federal district court, in a case called Democratic Party of Washington State versus Reed, the federal court appeared to uphold Washington State's blanket primary law. However, in 2003, a Ninth Circuit overturned that law, saying it was illegal after all, just like the California blanket primary, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to review that in 2004. So all of this was happening in 2004. At the same time, the Washington State Grange decided to file Initiative 872, which was introducing the concept of the top two primary. While that initiative was being prepared and people were gathering signatures, the legislature attempted to kind of preempt that initiative, and they proposed a top two primary option in the legislature, which went to Governor Locke's desk at the time, and Governor Locke vetoed that part of the bill, eliminating the top two primary from the legislative bill. So Initiative I-872, sponsored by the Washington State Grange, went on the ballot in 2004, and it was approved by 60% of the voters. So in 2004 as well, we also had the closest race for governor in Washington State history, Republican Dino Rossi versus Democrat Christine Gregoire. And it came down to just a couple hundred votes. The first two counts, Governor Rossi won. It looked like he was going to be the governor. However, in typical fashion, King County elections kept finding new discoveries of ballots in the trunks of cars, in closets, in hidden locations. And as they kept doing recounts in King County, they eventually got enough that Christine Gregoire was declared governor after the third recount. So the Washington State Republican Party also looked at these results, and it became clear that had there not been a third party on that ballot, the Libertarian candidate, it looked then, and most of those votes were perceived to go to the Republican candidate, Dino Rossi, that they would have had a Republican governor with a much bigger margin. But nevertheless, that was the drama of 2004. You had this top two initiative that got passed. You had this incredibly close race where had the third party candidate not been on the ballot, the Republicans would have won. And yet still the parties, all the parties decided that they still wanted to eliminate this top two primary idea, and they wanted to get back to where the powers would be shifted more to the party. So there was a lawsuit filed in 2005 by the Washington State Republican Party versus Washington. That was the name of the case. However, the Supreme Court rejected that, and they said that the top two primary system was legal in Washington state. And that is how we get to the top two primary system that we have now. Now, what is a top two primary? It's sometimes called the jungle primary. I oftentimes refer to it as a jungle primary because it's an easier way for people to remember. But basically what it means is that everybody's name is on the ballot, and regardless of what political party affiliation that you have, and the parties really can't control even who wants to put their names on the ballot and claim they have affiliation, everybody gets to put their name on the ballot, and it's only the top two vote getters that move on to the general election. So it changes the dynamics quite a bit. And in 2004, Washington State was the first legislature to ever approve this top two primary system. Now, since that time, California followed Washington's footsteps, and in 2010 they went with a jungle primary system. The state of Nebraska does this sometimes for some of their state legislative offices. But generally, this is pretty unusual. And this is why when consultants sometimes come from DC or from other parts of the country into Washington State to get themselves involved in elections, especially at the primary level, they don't always understand how the jungle primary or this top two primary system works. But it's very unique to Washington, it's fairly unusual, and it changes the calculus at the primary level with who you're going to put on the ballot. And you really saw this, why has a big impact. In the 2016 elections, most notably, this is very high profile, for a statewide office, state treasurer, you had 3 Democrats in the primary and 2 Republicans. And what happened is, the 2 Republicans came out as the top 2 vote getters. Washington State has historically been electing Democrats for statewide office. However, the 3 Democrats in this race were so closely aligned that it was kind of a fratricide thing where they basically eliminated each other in the primary. And the 2 Republicans, who were close enough to each other as well, they were able to actually come through and to the top 2. So in the 2016 general election, voters in Washington State only had 2 choices for state treasurer, and they were both Republicans, which is how we have Republican State Treasurer Dwayne Davidson today. The first time in 50 years a Republican's been a statewide office holder in the Treasurer's office has been a Republican. And that could only happen in a top 2 primary. Now, we have Governor Inslee, a Democrat, who has failed to break the 1% mark in his effort to run for president. And he's already been a 2-term governor. The assumption was that he wasn't going to come back and run for governor again, but he changed his mind and he decided to come back and run for governor. However, there were some complications because there were 3 Democrats who had, of high prominence, who had already expressed an interest and in some cases planned and filed campaigns ready to go to run for governor. One of them was Attorney General Bob Ferguson, and one of them was Commissioner of Public Lands, Hillary Franz, and one of them was King County Executive Dow Constantine. These were all serious candidates. They have the ability to raise a lot of money, they have statewide appeal, and this would have been just a food fight that the Democrat Party would not want to have, particularly in light of what they just experienced in 2016 for the state treasurer's race, and in light of the fact that already with Inslee on the ballot, you had at least 4 different Republicans who had declared there were serious Republican candidates for office. And so Inslee was able to get the other Democrats to cancel their aspirations for running for governor, get them to bail out, and it looked like it was just going to be him versus a handful of Republicans, and whichever Republican would prevail in the top 2 would be moving on to the general election. However, things have changed. Initiative King Tim Eyman put his name in the ballot just a couple weeks ago. He announced, I should say, that he's going to run for governor. Now, he's running as an independent. What's significant about this is that normally when somebody who is an independent or they're with a less high-profile political party like the Socialists or like the Libertarian Party throws their name on the ballot right now in a top 2 primary system, they get caught up in the mix. If you see this picture right here on the election results, there were a ton of people in the 2016 governor's race, but clearly only 2 people were the top vote getters. Incumbent Democrat Inslee and lead Republican challenger Bill Bryant. And you had tons of other people that they would say that they were the Socialist Party. You had Good Space Guy running. I will say, to the credit of the voters of Washington State, Good Space Guy got more votes than the Socialist that was on the ballot in 2016. But at the end of the day, regardless of how many other people jumped into the primary, because it's a jungle primary and a top 2 system, only the top 2 vote getters move on, and it really doesn't matter how many other people jump in. And this isn't fair to, potentially, it's not fair to third parties or small groups like libertarians or socialists who want to get their candidate on the ballot in November, because the primaries just basically, usually it overwhelms them and eliminates them. But with somebody like Iman now running for office, that really does change things quite a bit. Because you know that Inslee is going to be the only serious candidate running for governor in the primary, the only serious Democrat candidate, I should say. Iman's going to be the only serious independent candidate on that ballot, and he is a serious candidate because he has unusual name recognition. And then you're going to have 4 Republicans who are serious that are on the ballot as well, and only 2 of these people are going to be in the general election. So at the end of the day, it's just going to be a question as to who it is that's going to be on the ballot next to Inslee, because nobody seriously thinks Inslee can't get through that primary. And so the fight between Tim Iman, or really for the remaining votes between Tim Iman and these Republicans, is going to be what the primary, in a top 2 jungle primary system, it really matters. But whoever it is, it's going to be Inslee versus somebody. It isn't going to be split up where you have a Ross Perot situation and somebody's on the ballot taking, you're splitting up the opposition. That gets ironed out in a top 2 primary system, and it's just going to be whoever faces off against Inslee. So that's how Washington State's top 2 primary system works. And for those who hadn't heard this before, I hope this was helpful. If you want to learn more, please go to WeTheGovern.com. You can also click on some of the links below for some related content. Feel free to like, to subscribe, to share with others. And I look forward to seeing you next time.